Hi, I'm Teresa Alvarado, Deputy Administrative Officer at the Santa Clara Valley Water District. Welcome to the People Behind Your Water. Today we have a video clip of Mr. Chuck Bonham, the Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. On December 9th, he presented to our Board of Directors about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. As of that date, the plan had not yet been submitted to his agency for regulatory review or approval. Instead, he shares with us his perspective as a gubernatorial appointee and director of an important state regulatory agency. He is both passionate and pragmatic, genuine in his desire to reflect the variety of stakeholder interests that must be involved in solving California's water challenges. I hope you enjoy.
So my name's Chuck Bonham, and I have the greatest job in the world. I get to serve in this administration for this governor as director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Where I want to start mostly is describing to you some context to which our department comes to this challenge. And the first context is one on the landscape side. And as Mr. Schmuty described well, the historic size of the Delta was inspiring. It was an incredibly temporally and landscape-driven complex mosaic of functioning variables from tidelands to riparian to estuary to freshwater across a huge footprint. It's fair to say in your mind, when you think about the Serengeti or the great grasslands of the Midwest or the Everglades, you should also be putting that delta as it was in existence in that same category of great landscapes on the continent. And just as a sense of how that size has shifted over time, the U.S. Geological Survey in '94, I think, said in about 1850, the size of that landscape was about 540 square miles of freshwater wetlands and 308 square miles of saltwater marsh. Today, the total is about 48 square miles. We've got about left 3% of that historical footprint. The other thing I want to talk about quickly as to context is water and the relationship between water and fish. Okay. So I think my next conversation component is true both for Delta smelt, longfin smelt, as well as it is for anadromous salmon, steelhead fish. Fish need water. Particularly on the anadromous front, these fish have complex life cycles. And those life cycles involve moments in their presence on the planet, like migration, spawning, rearing. And there are metrics by which we in our profession as biologists judge species health relative to those life cycles. Their growth, their recruitment, meaning how many more fish will come back the following year to the population, their abundance, their distribution across their historical habitat. And at the same time, we know water defines California, either because of its abundance or because of its scarcity. And that within any given year, we've always had natural variability when it comes to water, our hydrograph. We have tended to have higher flow rain events in the winter, less rain, lower river flows in the summer, a declining hydrographic limb in the spring as those high flows trend off and our snowmelt is decreasing as it runs down slope. And we've also had that variability between years. And you know this as professions in this field. Years of drought, years of flood. Now, over time, fish have adapted that complex life cycle to that natural variability. And these species occupied the delta in balance with that variability as to flow and the quality and the timing of year that you might see water moving through or in the delta. But today we've got a highly altered hydrograph. Right? So it's dangerous to spend too much time on numbers often, but for a general sense, if you think about the two major rivers that are moving into the delta, so flowing south from the north of Sacramento and coming up the valley, the San Joaquin, maybe those two rivers had an average unimpaired runoff of about 40.3 million acre-feet. Okay? Now, today, that average annual outflow, those two rivers and everything moving out through the Golden Gate, is about 22 million acre-feet. So you have a highly altered hydrograph. It's not what it once was. Maybe it's about 50% less than what it once was moving out the Golden Gate. And that's not surprising. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that's a subjective observation. It's just an understanding of how we are today relative to where we might have been. It is largely driven by our strong need for consumptive use of water across multiple sectors: agriculture, municipalities, drinking water, so on and so forth. I think it's also a reflection on understandings years ago which may not be the same understandings today. Both President Hoover and Joseph Stalin made remarks very similar, that every drop of water that enters the sea is a wasted drop of water. When I started in this profession, which is kind of conservation, natural resources management, I was struck by the fact that today when we talk about dam reoperation, resource landscape planning, we're talking about really refined disciplines: geomorphology, fisheries biology, and much of that science and those fields didn't exist 50, 75, 100 years ago. We also know that you can manipulate flow to produce positive response in fish species, right? Now, I believe, like Curtis, it's unlikely one can legitimately in a public policy arena talk about actually trying to recreate the historical baseline. But I do think in the context of a flow discussion, it's possible to try to more mimic the natural flow period, or the natural flow regime, or the natural ascending and descending limbs. And that when you try to recreate the physical characteristics of a hydrograph, you actually find you produce biotic benefit for fish species. So here I just want to talk about science for a quick moment. And when it gets down to the question of flow and fish, I find two things, right? On one hand, I often find that the science is very complicated. In fact, many in the profession spend entire careers building intricate, complex models to tease out the precise relationship between flow and habitat and species population, and estimating or forecasting abundance in response to any given action. That discussion can be highly complicated and complex. But at the exact same moment, much of the science is very simple and very clear. We know that there's a positive correlation between flow and aquatic species health. At the same time, to give you another either paradox or extreme irony, this delta is probably one of the most heavily studied places in the entire world. Yet, there are important, fundamental, not yet fully understood scientific hypotheses we've got to sort out. So let me take all of that and turn to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan specifically. But first with a couple of caveats. So the first thing I need to help you understand about my role as director of this department is that our department is not an applicant for a permit here. Our department is actually the decider of an application we expect to receive from the Department of Water Resources. So our department has not yet made any determination because first, we have not yet received an application, nor have we received the plan. But at some future moment, we expect to receive it, and then we'll go through a process like we do on any application to permit a natural community conservation plan, whether it's permittable or not. So what I'm getting ready to walk you through is more my personal view, not any departmental position, and shouldn't reflect in your mind or anyone listening the sense that the department has been pre-decisional as to this Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So kind of get that structure. This is important for me to get the head nod from the director members. So there are things in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan that, for me, hold great promise as a conservation and restoration and landscape scale commitment for the Delta. And here are a few of those. So, 10 years as a water lawyer in California, coming from the nonprofit conservation NGO world to this position, my past experience has shown for me that when we're talking about a need for restoring the landscape Curtis walked you through, if we end up focusing on any one species, we're not taking a broad enough view to achieve true conservation. Here, what I like about the conservation plan is it is about 57 species, not any given one. It is charting a much broader view across a fuller range of both aquatic and terrestrial species. That is a solid conservation principle from a planning perspective. Okay, next thing I like. There's a higher legal standard involved. Okay, we've all lived this potentially. I know I have. What tends to happen in my experience in complex ecosystems where you have an interface, particularly around water, between a need for an in-stream use of water and a consumptive use of water is that we end up in the courtroom, right? The Ninth Circuit famously said, water litigation is a weed that flowers in the arid West. Right? The Delta proves that premise true. And what happens often when we end up in the courtroom, particularly under the rubric of the Federal Endangered Species Act or the California Endangered Species Act, is we're arguing about a legal term of art which is recovery. What is that responsibility on the actor to avoid the extinction of the species? Now, I happen to believe that's a moral responsibility, avoiding extinction, right? But what tends to happen, in my experience, is you're arguing about avoiding extinction, and the system is adjusted incrementally to keep you off of that extinction bottom floor, if you will. So you take some incremental measure and you move up away from the threat of extinction. Well, what happens? 5 or 10 years later, you're right back in the same conflict, and the very same parties find themselves typically back in the same courtroom, and you're talking about another incremental twist of the dial to stay off the floor of extinction. What I think is more promising is a different legal standard: recovery. Conservation. What does it mean to actually take the actions necessary to ensure healthy populations across as much of their historical habitat as possible, that they are abundant, that they are diverse, that they are having great recruitment, and that they are healthy over time? That is actually a legal standard, and that is the standard by which these plans will succeed. They may only be permitted if they're achieving that higher standard. That's a solid conservation principle. Next, biological goals and objectives. So we're moving off of management for one species to 57. We're moving away from the legal standard of avoiding jeopardy to conservation and recovery. And this plan currently has 214 biological goals and objectives. They are specific, they're measurable, they're actionable, they're relevant, and they're time-bounded. Let me give you a mind-numbing example. A delta smelt goal that you would find if you were to crack the plan. Increased end-of-year fecundity and improved survival of adult and juvenile delta smelt to support increased abundance and long-term population viability. Another layer below that is an objective. I'll read you an example objective. Achieve a recovery index greater or equal to 239 delta smelt for at least 2 years of any consecutive 5-year period. What does that mean, you might ask? Okay. If we're successful and the plan is permittable, I think what you'll find is an implementation of a plan where the decisions made about the operations of the facilities are directly connected to satisfaction of those biological goals and objectives. In other words, you would judge performance of the water operation and delivery side of the equation against the biological goals and objectives. If that happens, now we're cooking with gas. Because in my experience in the Delta, the two have been divorced largely rather than integrated. Those who are worried that this particular plan is simply about exporting more water to Southern California, I take comfort personally in the commitment to 214 goals and objectives. Next thing I like, habitat. 145,000 acres. Trying to go into the right places of the Delta, working in partnership with local governments and landowners to bring back that landscape in smart, strategic ways. This idea of trying to recreate in really tactically smart and strategic locations a more natural landscape. We know this can work. I'll give you 3 examples. In 2007, we once again flooded Liberty Island for the benefit of Chinook. We can see that it produces positive returns in fish species. In the slides you saw from Mr. Schmuty, the Salmon Fatty Project, we literally know that if you can reconnect floodplain habitat to the river, allow salmon to spend more time back up on that floodplain, they're more likely to grow big. Why does that matter? Technical term. The bigger they are going out into the ocean, the more likely they are to return. It's that simple. This plan in large part is about, in fact, there's an entire conservation measure dedicated to reconnecting that floodplain habitat to fish for the purposes of growing those salmon bigger and getting them out in the ocean more healthy. Next thing I like, and let me be really specific here because this reflects an evolution of my own personal thinking, which is somewhat dangerous for me to share, but it's candid. We have to get off the South Delta pumps from a fish perspective, period, full stop. You'll recall that a major component of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is to move the point of diversion from the lower part of this slide to near Hood, directly on the Sacramento River, up above the P on the slide. I didn't know, I now know. 1964, before I was born, our department went to the state legislature. Our department actually went to the American Fisheries Society. Our department took the formal public position. If you stop the design and construction of the delivery system, the project, just with a reliance on those South Delta pumps, you're going to drive these fish into extinction. Lo and behold, that's where we are now. Why? Those pumps create a reverse flow effect. They create an unnatural hydrograph. rather than the water coming up from the Sacramento or the San Joaquin, which in this slide is kind of, if you're looking at it, rightish bottom, and that water moving through the delta and out to the gate, which in this slide is middle left, or that fresh water. Remember that description I began with of all that water naturally coming through, coming down the Sacramento and moving out to the gate. It is sucked south. That is an unnatural flow regime. As a result, 2 out of 3 fish that get pulled down there die. The problem in a grand scheme of things, yes, habitat restoration, yes, more fresh water going out the Golden Gate, yes, but also yes, if we don't physically fix that conveyance problem, it's likely we'll continue to have the same 2 out of 3 mortality risk. And that unnatural, confused flow pattern because of those pumps effect produces this mortality situation for our department. If you look at our juvenile Chinook run that's coming out of the Sacramento and trying to make it out in the Pacific Ocean, that juvenile run's mortality rate is about 60%. And on the San Joaquin side, that juvenile same run mortality rate goes up to like 90, 95%, largely driven by that unnatural pumping effect. And we've seen this before. As a water lawyer, there's something very much alive in water law, which is the physical solutions doctrine. The idea that your infrastructure can relate to an improvement in an environmental condition is not novel. Next thing I like, and then we'll wrap up. Now, yes, our department is very worried about this, as I believe our federal counterparts, the National Marine Fisheries Service, are. What happens, the question goes, Chuck, when you move such a large diversion directly onto the Sacramento? You need to pay careful attention to that. At a minimum, what must happen is those new diversions on the Sacramento have to be screened according to 2013 technology. The screens on the South Delta pumps, at least 45 years old. We know far more today, like we do relative to the risks of tobacco, about screening large diversions than we knew when those facilities were built. The 2 other elements, I think, in the plan that are worth noting are adaptive management and governance. Look, adaptive management at the end of the day is going to come down to trust. And it is hard to trust each other in California on water and species management issues, right? It just is. And at the end of the day, the future perhaps is more of where the emphasis on the syllable should be than our past. Because when you think about it, if this plan does become permitted, it's potentially 50 years worth of implementation, which is a far longer time frame than the 7 years the plan has been an idea, or the 3 years this administration has been improving upon the original ideas put forward by the last administration. So that 50 years really will relate to how people believe the adaptive management approach will work. Here's my view on adaptive management. You got to stipulate up front a couple of things, or you're not being truthful about how the future will operate. First, look, a criticism I valid, I think, of adaptive management is the people designing it are often unwilling to admit there's uncertainty, that they don't know all the answers. Well, of course there is. That's the point of adaptive management. Right? I think you have to embrace the fact that this landscape is one of the most highly studied and yet still unknown. And once you are willing to accept that, I think you can then design an adaptive management strategy that accounts for uncertainty. The second thing you find problematic in adaptive management approaches is the people who design them are rarely the people 20 years later implementing them. So you have to focus on continuity of program implementation. Lastly, it costs. And those are hard dollars to raise often, either in the public or private arena. The implementation, the monitoring over time. Governance. I believe that when the draft is published in mid-December, many people will acknowledge the governance components have been greatly improved upon. I know our department in the last weeks have been focused on items like ensuring that the statutory authority given to my department remains with my department for decision-making through the 50 years and is not divested from my department. I believe you'll no longer see components of plan implementation that trigger a concern that inappropriate parties have veto control over species or biological goal and objective decisions. And I also believe you'll see that the feeling some may have had of an appeal right to political levels has been addressed. So I'm confident this component of governance will emerge in December in a better state than the prior drafts the public has seen. Let me end by just telling you this. And I don't know if this sums up my particular view at this moment in time, but I share it as a reflection of the struggles and evolution I'm going through, both on the Delta and this particular project. So, someone was writing an article in the Washington Post about 3 months ago, I think, about the effort to restore the Elwha River, which is near Seattle on the Olympic Peninsula. And it's one of the larger dam removal efforts underway in the country. And the writer was interviewing Mike McHenry, who's a fisheries biologist for the lower Elwha tribe. And Mike said, quote, "When I got into wildlife biology, I never thought I'd be working with excavators. But I came to realize that if you want to return nature back, you have to go big." Now, I'm not saying big ever recreate our historical landscape. I don't think it's feasible. But I do think big in the sense of a conservation planning effort that's across 57 species, 214 biological goals and objectives, an incredibly ambitious effort to restore about 150,000 acres of habitat, driven by science to a higher legal standard, may qualify as big. And at the end of the day, some commitment by all of us to something like that to turn around our status quo dilemma might be necessary. And our department wakes up in the middle of the night because we struggle with this literal fact, which I will leave you with. We are #1 in the nation in biodiversity. We have more kind of species diversity than any other state in the union. That makes me really happy. What makes me really sad? We're #1 in the nation in loss of biodiversity. And it's those kinds of dilemmas, it's these kinds of issues that I think I just am thankful you are approaching thoughtfully, deliberatively, hearing all perspectives, knowing these are hard decisions, but really decisions that must be made for California's future. So thanks.